I've got a lot of code to show you, and that can be boring, so I'm going to try and make it not boring, and we're going to try and move pretty quickly. I apologize if you can't read the code on the slides. I did my level best. I spent a lot of time, but it's hard to get, you know, much code in very big letters. So I think it'll work out.
Can you turn off the lights here?
You really wanted me to put everybody to sleep, don't you? I don't know where the switch is, but I'm game.
Okay, there's that. Oh yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right. No, you're welcome. So thank you. So these are the objectives that I submitted in the abstract. I'm not going to talk about IDEs because I didn't really have room in the presentation, and I think that's kind of the least interesting thing that we could talk about of these topics. So I promise I won't use any more, almost no more PowerPoint animations. I hate PowerPoint animations, but I got carried away on this slide. It seems like the last several customer sites that I've been at, I've been on the development side, supporting the developers, and it seems like if it's stored in a DB2 table, it's my problem. And if their application goes awry and writes a bunch of bad data and munges a bunch of things up, they come to me to fix it. And that's fine, I suppose. But you know, there are sometimes 30 or 40 Java developers over in the development lab, and there's one DBA. And I've got, you know, Korn shell and the command line processor to fix these things with. And they've got IDEs and Java and toolkits and all this stuff. And over the last several years, I've gotten tired of that situation, and I'm trying to build myself a toolkit and get some better utilities in place and use some better languages to solve these problems. And I don't know if anybody in here is old enough to remember Jeff Spicoli from Fast Times. You know, my dad's a TV repairman. He has an awesome set of tools I can fit, or an ultimate set of tools. I had to Google that because I had the quote memorized improperly. But we should have a good tool bag. When we have a problem, we should be able to reach for an elegantly crafted tool to solve the problem, not just use our big hammer to, you know, to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So that's my goal, is to give you some better tools to work with DB2 with and to solve problems with. Sometimes our problems, and sometimes, you know, our customers or our users' problems. That, when I was a Unix admin, that was my favorite bumper sticker. So like I said, a lot of times I feel like we go into battle with a plastic sword and a cardboard shield, and we're wrestling problems that are much more complicated than that. So I'm going to talk about Korn shell, and then I'm going to talk about every DBA's favorite, probably, programming language, stored procedures a little bit. Then I'm going to talk about the Perl DBI, and then Java JDBC. And I was a developer for a lot of years, but it was a long time ago, and Java didn't exist. So I'm just learning the JDBC, and the Java code that I'm going to show you is kind of a prototype. And for all I know, it could be the worst Java code in the world. So if you see something that you don't like and could be a lot better, shoot me an email. You can throw rotten vegetables at me if you want, but you know, the goal here is to help each other and learn. So here's some of the manuals that I found online and come with the product to write in different languages against DB2. So I'm kind of embarrassed to tell you this, but I actually put this in production at a customer site in a hurry. I got assigned on a Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock. Hey, can you write some code to delete all the records out of this table? Sure, I can do that. I think there's 5 issues with this code. And to keep you awake, I want you to tell me what they are. I'll give you one right now. I'm piping everything to T. I don't know if you can see this pointer, but I'm piping everything to T down there, And there's no way to catch a return code if that select statement, or if any of those statements go off the rails. There's no way to catch that return code because it disappears down the pipeline. And when you check the Korn shell return code, you're going to get the return code of T, which usually works. So I don't really know a solution to that one off the top of my head in Korn shell. But I hate doing that to write out to a log file because I'm imperfect and I'm in a hurry and I always miss the one line. I forget to put the T command to pipe it to the log file, and the one thing that I wanted to see in the log after an 8-hour run I didn't get. Does anybody see anything else? You can't see it on this slide, but there's no exit code. It's always going to return a 0. So if you call this thing from some other program, it's always going to work whether it dies or not. Come on, we're DBAs. What's the obvious one here? Anybody see a commit anywhere? What if this is fine if it deletes 1,000 rows. But what if I don't run it for a month and it tries to delete 1 billion rows? It's going to blow the log files up, first of all. It's probably not going to be very efficient if it doesn't blow the log files up. So that's the first thing that I had to solve, because this thing deleted on the order of 4 million rows a day. And it wasn't going to work like this. But when you get assigned something on a Friday night, sometimes you do things that make you feel a little unclean. Let's see. So I said the return code going down to T, and we talked about commits and the exit. Now I've got to remember the other two. So there's no error checking in general. If every SQL statement fails, I'm never going to know it. And what's the other one? Oops. Okay, don't touch the mouse. All right, so there's one more trivial one in there. I'll figure it out in a minute. So I wanted to point out some cool things in Korn shell that you may or may not know. I don't have any idea what your background is, but that's how, if you want to set something uppercase in Korn shell, you do a typeset -u. This is how you would pass into the variable DB name. $1 would be the first command line argument. That's how you make a default if the user doesn't give you one. And I like doing that and pointing it at the sample database because it'll probably still run and do something interesting at least, but it won't run against a database I didn't intend it to, and it won't die ugly. I also wanted to point out that what we're really doing here is running with a backtick. It's shelling out from Korn shell and running the command in the background and capturing the output and stuffing it in the variable, which is fine as long as you get back what you expect to get back and your variable ends up with what you expect. And I want to point out that we're using the command line processor of DB2 here when we do this in Korn shell.
One question, where does the purge timestamps comes from?
In this example, the purge timestamp's a column in the table, and the application says, hey, I've written this row out here and you can delete it in a week or a month or a year. And there's probably some tuning possibilities with that purge timestamp plus 7 days. That might drive you off an index also. I have to think about that. But so I said, all right, I got to make this better. What's the first step? So the first thing I know what the other error was. There's a race condition in here because I say select, I'm going to delete 100 rows. There are 100 rows eligible to be deleted. And then some non-zero time later, I say I'm going to delete maybe more than 100 rows. Maybe some rows have become old enough to be purgeable. So I might say I'm going to delete 100 rows and then delete 1,000. And there's not much code in between there, but it's possible. So to solve that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of drive a marker in the ground and say, I'm going to delete anything older than this time in this script. And then I'm going to use that same timestamp in the delete and eliminate that race condition. Some rows might stay there that have become old enough in the last couple of milliseconds, but we can live with that. At least the script will be correct. It may not be perfect. And then I'm going to put this in a loop, and the only way that I can think of to get intermediate commits in there with plain SQL and Korn shell is to do something like fetch first rows only in a select, and then I'm passing a chunk size variable in. I want to delete 1,000 rows at a time and then commit. And that's all fine. So I'm going to delete one chunk at a time in a loop here. And now I've got to do some error checking. I've got to figure out how many rows did I really delete. So I'm doing a DB2 minus A up there, which returns the SQL CA response. And then I've got to do some hokey piping through cut. And you know, I'm not real happy with this as a solution because it's kind of fragile. What if something changes in that SQL CA output? But that's how you can a brute force way to get how many rows were affected. The other problem with this is that it's going to rerun that select for every chunk if I commit every 1,000 rows. And that might be okay, but in this case, that select was fairly expensive. And so rerunning that select made the deletes run, you know, an order of magnitude longer. And the select might be the biggest part of the work. So this is just an example of what the SQL CA output looks like and where I'm getting the SQL code and the error. It's SQL error D3, I think, has the rows affected in it. All right, so we do this with Korn shell and the command line processor, and there's a couple other things I'm not happy about. Application name being the biggest one. This particular application had 3,000 connections all the time, and many things running all the time. Most of them said DB2 underbar JCC.exe, so you couldn't tell who was running what. And all of my Korn shell stuff says DB2 BP. I've been told that WLM set client info would set this, but I've never had any success with that. It sets an application name, but it's not the one that DB2 top uses and list applications uses. So if anybody has any, Ian actually gave me a hint at lunch yesterday, something I'm going to check out, but I don't know a way to solve that problem yet with Korn shell. This application also had LUWs in some of those tables, and if you want to select a LUW through the CLP, you get 32K back. And if you want to see something in the LUW that's out further in that LUW, you can't see it. I don't have any way to hold cursors over a commit if you with the CLP. And like I showed you in that last slide, error handling's kind of less than stellar. And you'd have to have the client installed and everything to make this work. The database is cataloged. So I hate that piping a T through a log file, and I want to solve that problem. So in my Korn shell, I wrote myself a little set of standard libraries for my Korn shell stuff. And this was the first one that I really cared about. So my goal for writing this little utility or this little function is I want to write the standard out if I'm on a terminal. So when I run whatever script I'm running, I get some output. And it doesn't just return or sit there and do nothing and I don't know what's going on. I want it to write things to standard out. But if I run it from cron, I want it to just put its output in the log file. So I want it to just work, right? And I don't want to have to screw around with it because, you know, Monday morning or Friday afternoon, I'm going to run it and I'm going to screw it up. I want it to do the right thing automatically. And I want to be able to catch, you know, I want to solve that problem of being able to catch errors without having to put, or if I had to do something like T, I wouldn't be able to catch the errors. So this is my little start logging function. And it's pretty simple, but the first thing I'm doing is checking that I can write to my log file and stuff because, and I had these checks out in all of my application scripts, and I realized I'm always doing these checks, I should push them down into the function. And then I want the function to do something, like if I can't write the log file, well, see if you can give yourself permission to write the log file. Why not? You know, maybe you can't. Maybe the user doesn't have permission to do the chmod, but maybe the permissions are just set wrong on the file. So this is the rest of the function. And this is the coolest thing that I've ever figured out how to do in Korn shell. It uses a coprocess, and what it does is this says if either standard error or standard out is connected to a TTY, then T the output into the log file and shoot it out to the TTY and then send standard error to standard out and pump it all through a coprocess. And it's a little hard to figure out what that's actually doing, but it works. And then if you're not connected to a TTY, just put all the output in the log file, standard out, standard error and standard out. So if I'm running from cron, it doesn't shoot like in AIX. I think cron dumps everything out to a file and mails it to the user. So your user ID ends up with a full mailbox and the Unix admins call you in. It's not good. So that start logging function works pretty well. It does what I want it to do. This is a stop logging, so in any Korn shell script, I just say start logging, stop logging, and I get what I want. And I probably, since I've been harping about error checking and stuff, I probably should check and stop logging and make sure that I actually started it and have co-processes set up and stuff before I tear them down. But you never get an error from this, even if they're not set up. So I'm pretty happy with it. So this is what it looks like when you call it. You just call start logging with a log file. And I want to point out, I pass in, or I pull in my profile and I pull in my function library. And that profile is important. I mentioned running from cron. You probably all know that if you run from cron, you get a crippled little environment that doesn't have everything that your standard environment has in it. So your script might run fine from the command line and not run at all from cron. Another cool Korn shell trick, this is how you read from a file into like the equivalent of a file descriptor. So I'm saying read from that recipe file into 7. And if you want to read from more than one file at a time, that's how you do it. So let's see, I think that's the equivalent of a file descriptor. I just threw this slide in because I wanted to point out these Korn shell options down here. If you run a Korn shell and you pass a -X on the command line, it turns on a trace, which is really useful if you're debugging something, you can't figure out why it's doing what it's doing. If you want to set that inside the Korn shell, you do a set-O X trace. And then set-O no unset says if I use a parameter that isn't set or use a variable that isn't set, it'll die with an error. So you don't have to check every line, have a if did I get an error kind of thing. And then set error exit does the same thing. If you get a non-zero return code, it'll die, and it'll dump out the return code. And that way you don't have to have error checking after every line in your script. Some other stuff that I've seen in Korn shell. I'd never seen this one until the contract that I'm on now. There was a guy that loved this and did it all the time. This is just a standard pipeline to figure out what databases are on the machine. And then he's piping it through read and pushing the database names into this while loop. And it's fine. Here's an actual example from that customer site where they did that 3 times in this while loop. So what's actually happening here, you're doing the select and pushing it into temp, and then you're feeding temp into the while loop down here, pushing it into I, select from where the doc ID is equal to I, push that into A. It's kind of cool, and it's a good way to populate a variable in Korn shell, but I worry about what if T doesn't end up with what I thought it was going to, and there's really no clean way to validate that things are working in the middle of this. So I don't know if I'm really a big fan of this. So some other things are kind of cumbersome in Korn shell. This is a chunk of my backup script in Korn shell, and I'm doing an online backup and I'm using TSM, let's say. And I want to say, okay, I've done this online backup and it's got a whole bunch of log files in it. I need to find out what the oldest log file is in that TSM backup, and then say I want to delete all the older log files than that, because I don't care. I have a good online backup, it succeeded, and it's maybe log file 30. That is the best way I could figure out to subtract 1 from a log file name in Korn shell. And Perl, probably 30 characters, 2 lines of code maybe. So moving up the food chain a little bit, most DBAs that I've worked with, if they need to write a program, this is where they go. They go to stored procedures, and especially if they've worked on a database that starts with O, they do stored procedures. Stored procedures are great. I love them for pushing application logic down into, storing it in one place instead of having it in a bunch of places. The sort of standard uses for stored procedures. I'm sort of less happy with them for doing the kind of stuff we're talking about here, like database utilities and cleanup stuff. But One thing I like to do in a stored procedure is set the terminator this way, because, so this is like passing in a DB2-TD bang or TD @ sign. And if you do this, the guy that runs it doesn't have to pay attention to what the terminators are, because, you know, I might use a bang and you might use an @ sign, and Ian might use something else. And then every time you go to run the compile a stored procedure, you have to go figure out what terminator to use. If you put this in your stored procedure, it's all self-contained, and it'll just run. So I'm passing in, I'm just going to reduplicate that delete script in stored procedure here. I'm passing back the SQL code. You know, there's no rocket science here. Create or replace I love for things like stored procedures. I mean, you can't use it on every kind of object, but it's fantastic, so you don't have to drop the object before you create it. Standard declare a cursor. I'm just going to do the same thing that I did in Korn shell. Order is important in stored procedures. If you put this declare down a few more lines here, it'll fail. You have to have all the declarations before the procedural code. And this is, I didn't use this continue handler in this little example, but I wanted to leave it in here commented out to show you how to do this. If you want to have a not found handler, this is the way you do it. So if you run out of data, it'll automatically fire. And this is what an exit handler looks like. So now we don't have to check every time we do a statement for check a SQL code. We can just put a handler at the top. And in, I believe in 9.7 with all the Oracle compatibility stuff, we got these DBMS output functions. And one of the things I always hated about stored procedures was there was no way to write any debug information out. There was no way to write any log out to a file. You know, I used to do frivolous things like creating a table with a varchar column in it and inserting my debug statements out there so I could see what was happening. Now you can actually write stuff out to a file. And you've got a new line function and a put line function and a put function. So I thought I knew how to do this, and I just cooked this little example up really quickly to put in this presentation. And about 36 hours later, I was still screwing around with this thing. One, I was writing so much output out that I blew the output buffer. And I got to find out what the default is. It's 20,000 bytes. And this output enable is how you can set that buffer to a size. The documentation kind of makes it look like you have to run that enable to get this to work, but I've never even known about that enable command, and I've been using these output functions for years. So that's how you make the buffer bigger. It's still kind of fragile in my mind, because what if I write 128,001 bytes? It's still going to die. So this is just my delete function. I'm passing in. I talked about how all these functions work. I'm just opening a cursor, do a priming fetch to get the first row. I'm passing that chunk size, how many rows I want to commit on in. Do a delete where current of cursor. Write out some logging information that blew the buffer up the first time around. Oh, this is how you get how many rows were affected by an update or a delete statement. You set get diagnostic row count. Then I do my one last trailing commit at the end of the while loop. And I also usually like to put the grant right in the stored procedure, so that, again, the stored procedure is kind of self-contained, because I'll be busy and I'll put the stored procedure out there and forget to grant it to the group that's supposed to have it, or the role that's supposed to have it. And then, you know, I've got this commit is the create proc commit, not the commit in the loop. And, you know, you're familiar with the semicolons are terminating the statements, and you have the outside terminator. We talked about the set terminator already. So after I wrote that, or while I was writing that, I was looking around at stored procedure stuff online, and I ran into this again. I'd seen this years ago, and Serge had this in a presentation out on the internet, and he contends that this is a faster way to do the delete instead of doing the cursor thing. And he's probably right. It probably is faster, but it's still going to redo the select every time, like my Korn shell version did. So this is just an example of how you'd call a stored procedure. I'm sure you all know how to call a stored procedure, but my point is, if I write a stored procedure to do this utility, I still have to have some stupid little wrapper script written in some other language to call it. It's another reason why I'm not crazy about stored procedures for this database, DBA, one-off utility kind of programming. So I mentioned all the stuff about cron with pulling in functions. And then down here's our, well, that's a connect statement. Oh, and here's another little Korn shell function I had to just try and determine if, to force you to give me the proper number of arguments when you call a script. So here's the call statement. And this seems really easy, right? Except I've got to pass a timestamp in. And the timestamp has to have single quotes wrapped around it. And Korn shell hates that. So I was programming on this, writing this on this laptop running Cygwin and DB2 Express, and I never got this to work through Cygwin. I had to go down and boot up my Linux box and get it to work there, and I had to resort to a here document just to get the single quotes to stick to the variable. And then the here document gives you a gratuitous new line, which really made me happy, so I had to chop that off with TR, and you know, there's a lot of little annoying hoops to jump through just to call a stored procedure. Oh, and those DBMS output functions, all those functions that kind of came with the Oracle compatibility stuff, you have to set server output to on to get them to actually work. So this is what the Korn shell under Cygwin was returning. It's kind of chopping the single quote off and stuffing everything, and it's laying it back over top of the DB2 call statement. I don't know, it was after midnight, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to make it work under Cygwin. So let's talk about the Perl DBI. You know, Korn shell scripts have their place. If I'm in a hurry and I need to do something and it's a one-off really quickly, fine. And the Perl DBI, the DBI is an interface that sort of obfuscates all the differences in the databases, and you have DBDs, database drivers, for each RDMS. So you could have, you know, a DB2, DBD, and then the DBI commands will be the same no matter what database is running underneath. That might be a good reason to use a higher level language right there, because if you don't use some of the special features in the databases, you could port the code back and forth. One problem with this, I worked at a government site and I could never get anything installed on the boxes. Like, it took about a year to get the DBI and the DBD compiled and installed on the AIX boxes.
For security reasons.
Oh yeah, for anti-productivity reasons. So I wanted to point out, when we went from AIX 5.3 to 6.1, we encountered a little interesting feature in 6.1 that made the Perl process not have any memory. I mean, it had like 4K or something. And if you set this loader control variable to whatever this means, you get some memory. Found that out the hard way. They set it on the prod boxes and the dev boxes, but not the test boxes. So I worked frantically till Friday to get my stuff ready, turned it in, and it failed on the testers on Saturday. And I spent all day Saturday rewriting it using, you know, 2 rows at a time so I could use this little tiny bit of memory that I had. Big fun. So this is a standard Perl DBI program. It's very simple. You do a DBI connect, user ID and password. Raise error says, just like that Korn shell switch, if you get an error, die. So you don't have to check everything all the time. And auto commit, we probably want turned off so that we can control commits. Oops, sorry. Then you run a prepare your statement, pass in a parameter marker, execute it, and give the variable that you want populated in the parameter marker. There's a series of DBI fetch commands to fetch into different Perl structures, and then there's a commit and a disconnect. Very simple. So here's one with an insert, same thing. I just wanted to point out how the parameter markers work. I debated this, putting this picture in because, well, you know, it's a little risque. But I figured it was good enough for 60s American television. If it got by the censors, it's probably okay for us. And I gave this at Insight, and I said after the Kevin Spacey keynote at Insight, all bets are off, right? So I didn't want to just redo that stupid little delete problem in Perl DBI. So I thought I'd show you the coolest thing I've ever written in Perl DBI. A couple of years ago, we were doing a lot of changes to the system. We were adding, like, maybe add a new column to this table, and we need to go populate it with some data from these other tables. And it was constantly doing, like, backfills in production, where we're taking some data from here and populating it over there. And just sort of the same problem over and over and over. And so my goal for this thing was, I want to actually put the SQL in the configuration file and not change the Perl code, and just have the Perl run a select, figure out what rows it's going to update, and then go update or insert or delete, probably not insert, but update or delete or run a merge against that set of data. Do some work. And I had a few nefarious goals with this. One is that it was almost impossible to get something tested and into production. But once I got the code tested, I could push a new config file very easily. And the other issue is that I had a bunch of DBAs working with me that weren't developers and didn't know Perl, didn't know Java JDBC, and they would try and do something complicated with a stored procedure or whatever. And so this way I could say, hey, just take this utility, you write the SQL, you do the hard part, put it in the config file, and it'll always work. So the goal, like I said, do a cursor fetch, get all the rows you want to update, and then update them. And the update might be delete, update, merge. You're only going to do the select once, so if it's expensive, that's not a problem. It's very efficient. You don't have to know any programming. And the only trick is that I'm going to select these rows and get, say, a list of primary keys, and then I've got to tie them to the rows that I want to update somehow, and I'm going to do that through parameters and parameter markers in the select and in the update statement. And I have to tell the Perl code or the code which ones go where. So this is what the config file or the ini file would look like, and I'm going to say what user can run it. I had a little function that said I only want one of these things to run at any given time. And that's not such a big deal for this backfill utility, but I have like a database monitor that runs and other things that run that get kicked off by cron, and I don't want them to run away and have 60 copies running. So I use a socket and I just say use this port number. And I have this run if standby flag, so if I'm running on an HADR system, do I want to run on the standby or not? Obviously, some utility like this, I don't, but my database monitor, I might want to run on the standby and keep track of the log buffer and everything, the gap, log gap. So I talked about those. How many rows do I want to commit? And then this is how you set the application name. I'm passing it in here. More ini file, where do I want to log to, what log level do I want to write. This kind of works like log4j in Java, where if I put debug in there, it's going to log everything debug and higher. If I put critical, it's only going to log critical errors. This is kind of a hokey select example. It's that delete problem again. And then I'm going to pass in, here's my delete statement, and I'm going to pass this parameter list in, and this says take key column 1 and key column 2 and put in these two parameter markers. And they came from the select statement. So this is the sort of magic glue that ties those two together. And then so I just put the comments in here because there's some verbiage about what I was trying to do with rollback. And I'll tell you about that in a second. So this is what the Perl code looks like. I just read the variables in from the ini file. I check to see whether I'm on the HADR primary or standby, make sure I'm only running once, make sure the proper user is running this thing. And then I just read my select statement in, and I can add a fetch first so many rows only or an isolation clause on the bottom. I prepare my SQL, and I prepare this is a select statement, and that's my update statement coming in from the configuration file. Then I run the select, and I keep track of times and how long the select took and everything. And I have a little loop that just does a fetch row hash ref, so I'm returning references to hashes and passing them back to Perl. And if you look at the Perl documentation, you'll see a whole bunch of back and forth about which one of these fetches is faster. Fetch hash ref is supposed to be slower. I don't care. The I/O is what takes all the time. The code running isn't a big deal. So then I pass that hash ref into my update statement and run it, and then I keep track of how many rows are updating per second, because I was running this in production a lot for like over a 12-hour run or a 24-hour run, updating millions and millions of rows. And I needed to see if it's slowed down at 3 a.m. Oh, that makes sense. That's when the backup started. So I talked about rollbacks a minute ago, and what I wanted to do with this was say, go ahead and do the update. And then if I have that update flag set to off, just roll back every time at every commit point. And that would show me sort of a worst case time of how long it's taken to actually do the work. It would be really worst case because it has to roll all the work back, but usually that's what you want to know. You know, well, this thing's going to run for 12 hours in production and it runs for 3 days, and you look like an idiot. If you get the worst case, then it's saying, well, it's going to run for 12 hours and it runs for 6. Everybody's happy with that, right? But that doesn't work because rollback drops all the cursors and shuts everything down. So it was a great idea, but it didn't work. What I ended up doing was just, if I had that update flag set off, I just said, here's what I would have updated. And that turns out to be really useful if you're trying to, I used this thing to solve, the application went off the rails and wrote some bad data for a couple of months. And we had to figure out an algorithm to identify which rows were bad. And I would run this thing on production with the update flag set off, and it would say, well, I would have updated these 3 million rows, and I would have changed, you know, John to Fred. And then we'd go back to the system owners and say, does this look right? Until we had an algorithm that we liked. So Perl turns out to be really handy for this kind of stuff because it doesn't care about typing very much, like data types. So it doesn't matter what columns I select, if it's a varchar or an int, Perl doesn't care, right? And I'm passing a reference to a hash and passing that hash in, and it all just works. It's magic. We're going to do this in Java. Java likes types, right? So this is just the end of the code, and I'm keeping track of how long did we run and at what rate, how many rows per second am I getting done, so I can keep track of it while it's running. This is what the log file looks like when you run it. I dump out what select statement I read in and stuff, and then I chop the middle of the log file out. But you can see if you have it set to debug, it's going to dump out all the data that it's updating, or all the data that it would have updated if you have the update flag set off. So I talked about all that. So I wanted to point out that once I got this tested and working, you can pass any SQL in there that you want. The select statement can be arbitrarily complex. I think that one I showed you had a join in it. I put a merge statement in the update to solve a problem, that problem where the application went kind of off the rails there for a while. I have a merge statement, and I have the code for the merge statement in the notes, and it's like 4 pages long, and it runs through the script just fine. And I apologize, some of the notes, when the PDF formatter chewed through it, some of the formatting didn't come out properly. Some of the text is real big and real small on the next page, but it's all there. So if you do something like that, you may end up needing some special drinks to keep track of it. So let's try and solve that same problem in Java. And you know, I think that the developers I work with in Java are all using JPA and the Java persistence now. But I think for the kind of thing that I'm trying to do, JDBC is probably a much better fit because I'm not a Java developer. And I wanted to do this in Java because a lot of times I'd like to get out of the business of doing this stuff. If your application goes off the rails, you go fix it. Just because the data's in a table, you know, that's what you do for a living. Why are you bothering me with this? If I give them a Perl utility, they're not going to know how to deal with that. If I give them a Java utility, I might be able to hand them the problem back. So I took the code right out of the sample directory in DB2 that gets installed with the product, and you'll see I didn't change some of the function names and stuff in here, so it should look somewhat familiar if you fooled around with the sample code. I did change, most of those samples use a data source, or I mean a driver manager, which is a JDBC type 2 driver. And I changed it to a data source, which is better to read from a property file and stuff. Sample JDBC looks a lot like the sample Perl DBI. If you don't get too wrapped up in the syntax of the language, it's the same thing. Do a connection, pass in some parameters, read my SQL string in, do an execute query, and you've got this result set object in JDBC that actually returns your data. So you do a while loop, you do a get int or a get string, and then you know, it's all very much the same. If you know one, you can probably do the other. Do the same, my properties file looks very much the same. I'm passing in an application name. I'm just setting some, you know, the packages that I'm using. You can see the SQL stuff. And I used an enumeration to read the property file in, and this is all really easy in Java. I mean, I found this enumeration stuff out on the internet and hacked this together in a few minutes. And look how easy the error handling is. This is the error handling to read that file. I don't have to mess around checking if statements after every statement. That's all good. This is just reading the config file in, and this is how you, if I don't put a property in the config file, this is the default, so it'll use false if I don't give it something. And I'm just pulling in that parm list. I've got to do the same thing here where I need to tell the utility which parameters to tie to which between the select and the update statement. So I'm just doing it in Java now instead of in Perl. And like I said, that method name comes right out of the DB2 sample code. Again, the error handling's pretty good. I'm going to prepare my statements, and then the result set returns its result set.object. There's also a result set get metadata. And remember I said Java really likes some types, so I've got to know what the types of the columns I'm passing in. So I have to do all this stuff that Perl just obfuscated and made work, I have to do by hand in Java and JDBC. So I get the metadata of the result set, find out what are my column names, what are the types of my column names, and I stuff all them in a hash so I'll have them later. And you know, it's a distinct lack of magic in Java because I'm not sure what strong typing brings to the party here, but I was a C programmer for years, so I'm not a big fan of this kind of thing in a language, but it has its place. So I'm storing the column name and the column type, and this is a good example of how that result set metadata works. And so what I did is I wrote two little functions to handle the pulling the column names out, or the data out, and then putting it back in the update statement. And all I have right now is the varchar and the small int, but there's only 20 odd data types in JDBC, so to make this work completely, you'd have to flesh these out with the other data types. Not a big deal. So you can see I've got to do a get string and a get int and a set string and a set int, and I've got to know which to use where, so that's, you know, what Java's forcing me into. But this code actually works, and it runs the same backfill utility that I built in Perl. And the code's all in the notes, whatever is in the, I snipped a few things out of the screens, but it should all compile just the way it is. So this is where I'm committing every chunk size rows. So when I got done with this, I was looking at the JDBC documentation a little more, and I found this get object and set object, and I thought, aha, this is how you get around this typing, because every subclass or every type in Java is a subclass of the type object. So I thought, okay, JDBC, they thought of this. This is going to work. All I have to do is take the variable and store it in an object. I can do a get object and a set object. Great theory, didn't work at all. The DB2 type 4 driver throws you an error and says, hey, you're taking an int and trying to put it in an object. We can't have that. So I threw a couple of links into, if you're a language geek and you care about this kind of stuff, Perl has auto-vivification, which is a fantastic word. And it just means if you, where I created that hash, or that hash reference, if I pass in 1 or 37, Perl will make enough in the array to hold it. Java probably won't. But, Perl also has what's called duck typing, which isn't strong typing or weak typing or no typing. So if you're curious, it's all there. It's all in the notes. So what Star Trek theme presentation would be complete without Lieutenant Uhura? In this thing, she says, you know, how awesome I am. And I hope that I've given you some ideas and some tools and some little stubs of code and some framework to make your toolbox better so that you can be awesome too. And please fill out your evaluations. Thank you.